All right, greetings everyone. And let me just do a mic check. Am I audible to the folks in the back of the room? Yes? All right. Okay, welcome to Visualization, Analysis, and Design. And let's go ahead and get started. I think I'm hearing some audio feedback. All right. So our schedule today is that we've got two sessions, afternoon session 1 and afternoon session 2. So we'll start out with this big idea of analysis, as I talk about in the title of this tutorial. What does analysis mean? What are we analyzing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing that? We'll then move on to this idea of decomposing visualizations into marks and channels. The idea is how to arrange tabular data and also spatial data. And after each one of those segments, we'll have some time for Q&A. And so then in session 2, we'll move on to talking about arranging network data. So how do we spatially arrange networks and trees? And then talk about color. And then how do we get to interaction? So far, we will have been focused a lot on visual encoding, on laying out data. What about interacting with data? How do we deal with multiple views? And then finally, how do we deal with data when there's so much of it we can't simply use the really simple approximation of one mark for every item of data? So again, we'll stop for Q&A after each one of those segments. All right, so let's dive in. And let me start out by defining visualization, right? Because that's what we're really going to be focused on. That's what this entire conference is focused on. So my own favorite definition of visualization is that computer-based visualization systems provide visual representations of data sets designed to help people carry out tasks more effectively. Okay, what's interesting about that definition? Why have I defined that the way I have? So for one thing, there's this idea that we're visualizing because we need to have a human in the loop, that there's some idea that data and people should go together. And in particular, visualization is most suitable when you're trying to augment the capabilities of a human rather than replace people with purely computational decision-making methods. So we don't need visualization when there is something that is fully automatic, it exists, it's trusted. So when is that not the case? Well, there's many analysis problems that are ill-specified. Sure, we could write a program to answer exactly one question, but what if we don't have one question? What if there's hundreds of possible questions or thousands of possible questions, and the answers to one will lead us towards asking the next one? So it's often the case that you don't just have a single, very crisply defined question. It's much more common that you've got a loop of analysis. You ask a question, you get some answers, you ask a new question, spurred by those answers, and so on. So analysis is typically an iterative cycle, not just a single cut and dried question. So what are some classic possibilities of this? Well, one possibility of what you design a visualization for is there are a group of people that are going to use this for a very long time, long-term use for end users. And a really classic example of that is exploratory analysis of scientific data. Now, it might not just be used to analyze what's unknown, it might be used to present what's known. Presentation of known results is what we see in contexts like data journalism, whether it's the New York Times or many other outlets are one example of presenting something that's already known. But there's also some interesting possibilities where visualization is actually trying to work itself out of a job. Your goal is not long-term use. It might be visualization as a stepping stone. Maybe what you want to do is develop some kind of a model, but you're not there yet. You cannot yet automate. You're even trying to understand what the parameters of that model should be. Or it could be that you've gotten further along this process of automation. You are developing an automatic solution, but you need to fine-tune it. You need to understand, do I have my parameters set right? Do I need to refine this model? Is it really reflecting what I'm trying to do? Or it could be that you're at the very end of a process of automation and you do want to deploy a model that you think is ready, but you need to help the people who will either make decisions or in some way buy in to the use of that model to verify, that the model is aligning with what their expectations are to build trust in those users. It might be a temporary step where you do that just before and around deployment, or you might continue monitoring an automatic solution in the long term. But again, all of these are situations where there is some need for a human to understand something, where you can't just automate. Okay, what about the next part of that definition? Why do we want a visual representation, an external representation, that is something outside of our own heads? So the big idea with this visualization as something that's outside your own head is that you're trying to replace a cognitive act with a perceptual act whenever possible. If I just give you a table of numbers, of course you can read individual numbers just fine. If all you had to do was maybe grab two of those numbers and compare them to each other, that's not so hard. But if I ask you about trends, even with this pretty small data set, it gets hard. You have to read a number, remember it, read another number, remember that, read another number, remember that, start doing internal arithmetic and comparisons, and the problem is that your working memory is actually not that great. So you start to lose track. You can't do that with, dozens or hundreds of numbers at a time. Human working memory is a pretty finite capability sort of a thing. So what we want to do instead is replace that cognitive act with a perceptual act, in this case, of actually, we've color-coded those quantitative attributes. In this case, it was response to two different conditions of an antibiotic and how genes are responding to that. So in this case, we're seeing a node link network of the relationships between a bunch of genes, and the key thing is that we've color-coded them according to these two different experimental conditions. On the top row is essentially the control state. On the bottom row is where there's been an intervention of actually treating with, in this case, it was a particular treatment to see if that would change the gene response. And what we see after the first hour, that first column, they're kind of the same in both. Second hour, they're still kind of the same, but in the fourth hour, in that third row, we see a lot more green on top than red. And then finally, in the 24th hour, after that treatment, you see things have settled, and they're pretty much the same. Now, you're able to make that perceptual inference very, very quickly compared to something involving looking at all those numbers and trying to cognitively compare those amounts. So this is one example of the kind of thing we can do with visualization. We'll be talking much more about a lot of the theory behind, well, how might we do that? So why is it so crucial to represent all the data? After all, we develop statistics for a reason. Statistical summaries are descriptions with great power and insight. So what are we trying to do with the visualization? Often we're trying to give the details underlying the summary, because details matter. You often want to either confirm something that's expected or find something that's unexpected. You might have a model and want to understand, are the assumptions of the model actually correct? And this is the kind of thing that people are often very good at. So a classic example developed by a statistician in the 70s called Anscombe's quartet is a group of 4 data sets that have identical statistics. The mean and the variance are the same. The correlation between X and Y is the same. So from simple descriptive stats, these things are the same. The instant I show you the pictures, you can see that they are not the same, right? What we have here is a situation where one might look a lot like what you might expect, a little bit of noise. One's clearly nonlinear, and so maybe a linear model is not an appropriate way. In one, we see that that trend line's a little bit off because of one pesky little outlier. And then that last one I love, it's the pessimal case where the trend line is completely misleading. Of course, this was a hand-designed data set in order to make that misleading. But unfortunately, in the real world, there's all kinds of things like this, and it only gets worse. This is 20 data points in a static data set. What about when there's thousands or tens of thousands or millions? What about when they're dynamic? What about when it's heterogeneous kinds of data? It's not just a table full of points, but also maybe some spatial data, some network relationships. So life only gets worse. And the ability to have a human do a quick check to see more detail than what you could see from a summary is a key idea in visualization. Now, of course, with interactive visualization, there's a lot of back and forth between different kinds of summaries and different ways of slicing and dicing. It's not necessarily just a single static picture. Just in case you're not quite convinced, a lovely paper a few years ago from the folks at Autodesk on the Datasaurus dozen pointed out that you could actually have ways of getting exactly these same statistics for many different kinds of data sets Note, these are all the same, even to the point of suddenly having a dinosaur hidden in your data. The goal is always look at your data, see what is unexpected, see what's actually in there. Visualization gives you an ability to do that. So why are we analyzing? What's the point of that? Well, what's useful is we want to impose some structure on what we can think of as a design space, the design space of all possible visualizations. How do you reason about them? How do you think about them? And the idea here is I'm trying to help give you a scaffold for thinking, to let you think systematically about choices. One of the ideas is if you get good at analyzing existing visualizations, that can help you. It's a stepping stone to getting better at designing new ones to fit particular constraints. Why is this important to do? Well, because if you do a random walk through that design space, you're doomed. Unfortunately, many possibilities are ineffective. There are many, as we'll talk about, combinations of tasks and data, and many, many ways to visually encode that data. And if you just pick randomly, you will have a very long walk in front of you. So understanding how to think about this more systematically is crucial. So a framework for analysis that I found very helpful, that I've proposed called the nested model, is this idea that there's 4 levels of design and 3 questions we can ask within them. And so we'll start out with this idea that you're often designing for a particular domain. I'm going to call that the domain situation. And you want to understand if you're designing for some kind of real-world specific use case, well, who are the people you're designing for? What are their concerns? How do they think about, what questions do they have that they somehow think could be answered through data? Now, what's crucial is that we don't just stop there. What we need to do is abstract. It could be that somebody doing high-energy particle physics and somebody doing genomic analysis of biological signals, they might use completely different words for talking about their data. They might use very different words for what they say they're trying to do. But it could be that at an abstract level, what they're doing might actually be very, very similar. And that allows you to then make design decisions. So what we want to do is abstract, to translate from domain-specific language to what I'll call the vocabulary of visualization. And there's 2 key questions that we need to ask. First of all, what are we showing? What is the abstraction of the data? And then, why is the user looking at this data? What are they trying to achieve? And that is about the task. And so we also want to abstract the task. Now, once we have that abstraction, then you can think about, well, how would I actually solve this problem? How would I address this question? How should I show my data? And again, we're going to split into 2 levels. One is this idea of what I'll call visual encoding. That is, what kind of useful picture am I drawing here? The other one is interaction. How can I manipulate that picture to dynamically change it interactively in response to something that I do as a user? So I'm going to call this the idiom level. Some people call it techniques, approach, method, many kind of equivalent words for that. But the key idea is that we've separated it from the algorithm level. And that's the question of once you've got a particular idiom, whether it's for visual encoding or interaction, well, how do you actually then compute this efficiently in some computational context? How do you instantiate that in a computable system? Now, why is it useful to divide it up into these 4 levels? It's because there's completely different ways to mess it up at each of these levels. At the domain situation, if you, for example, never even talk to your target users, you might not understand what they need. That's what can go wrong. Now, at the abstraction level, you might make poor choices about what to show them. It turns out that you don't just have to take the data as you're given it, you could transform it to some other form. And so if you have the wrong data abstraction, if you're showing them the wrong thing, the best visual encoding in the world can't solve their problems. But then, what can we do wrong at the idiom level? Well, it could be that the way you're trying to show it just doesn't work, that the human perceptual system is not actually going to respond and decode the information in the way that you, the designer, tried to encode it. And then finally, what can go wrong at the algorithm level? Well, your code could be slow as a dog. Your code could not be capable of keeping up with interactive frame rates. There's many ways to go wrong at this level as well, especially because no matter what you do, everyone always tries to load more data into your viz system than you design it for. That's a law of human nature. So there's almost always scalability questions. So the solution is, actually, we need to steal methods from a whole lot of different areas. Viz is a very interesting interdisciplinary field exactly because of this. And let's actually start at the algorithm level. There's a lot of work in visualization, which is exactly working at this level of algorithms. So these are methods well taught in a computer science curriculum. There's a lot of this technique-driven work where you assume that you already know all of those other things and you're focused at how do I make an algorithm to better solve a well-defined problem. So we might do things like measure the amount of time and memory it takes computationally. If you're more theoretically inclined, maybe you analyze computational complexity. So great, computer science arms you for this level very well. But what about those other levels? Well, we often want to get some ideas out of design, visual design, engineering design, for questions like deliberately coming up with multiple alternatives instead of fixating on your very first idea. But how do you measure whether or not these things worked? We often grab methods out of cognitive psychology and perceptual psychology, where if you ever want to actually check if people can understand and decode, you often do these lab studies, controlled experiments on human subjects, where you're going after some quantitative answers about things like, how long did it take a human to actually do something with this viz system? Did they get it right or did they get it wrong? So you measure things like human time and errors rather than computational time and memory. Sometimes you might actually say, well, let me just qualitatively analyze the results. Go through an image created by the system and discuss whether or not it's helping people understand that problem that you set up when you were doing your abstractions. But then how do you check if you got that task and data abstraction right? Well, for that we need to grab methods out of typically the social sciences, things like anthropology and ethnography, actually going in and observing what people do and talking to people. Talking is necessary but not sufficient, because what people do and what they say they do are notoriously very different things. And often what you want to do is actually deploy your system in a realistic use context and see what happens. How do the target users actually use that system? And so field studies are quite a different beast than controlled experiments in a lab. When we do this kind of work, where we would start with the domain situation and then work our way down through abstracting and designing idioms and then finally building something computational, we often call this problem-driven work, and in the Viz community, these are often called design studies. If folks are curious, I'm not going to go deep into it in this particular tutorial because we've got a lot of area to cover, but there is a paper with Michael Sedelmeier and Mariah Meyer that we did about 10 years back on design study methodology. You'll be hearing a little bit more about this on Tuesday morning because I'm happy that we will be getting the Test of Time Award on that. And it was what happened after we'd done about 21 of these design studies and thought about all the ways we went wrong and why this was hard and all the pitfalls we fell into. So there's a lot of trickiness to doing that kind of problem-driven work if what you're used to doing is technique-driven work. So that's a resource for that. But what I want to do is keep going back to this idea of these abstractions, the data abstraction and the task abstraction. So let's start out with the data abstraction, this question of what. So I'm not going to blast through all of this at once, but just the highlights. Let's talk about the kinds of data that you might be visualizing. So one of the most basic is tabular data. Somehow your data comes in the form of a table. In the simple case, think about it as a spreadsheet. The vocabulary I'm going to be using throughout this afternoon is when I'm talking about the rows in a spreadsheet, I'm going to call those items. And when I'm talking about the columns, I'm going to call those attributes. There are many different names in different communities of these. That's what I'll call that. And then you can think of the simple case as a flat table where then you have a cell where a row and column intersects. We'll get deeper into some questions of multidimensional tables a bit later. So big idea is you could have a table. What else could you have? You could have a network. You could have a situation where you're really focused not only on items of data, but interconnections between them. And in that case, often instead of just calling these items, we will call them nodes, and we will think about links between nodes. And we'll talk about some of the techniques to actually visually encode these a bit later, but let's just establish this as a kind of fundamentally different kind of data. And then finally, what about spatial data? What about data where there is something intrinsic about spatial position that is part of the data set itself? And one of the major ways that we often think about that is what I'm going to call spatial fields. Like, let's imagine that we go through, and in this room, we divide it up into a bunch of little small three-dimensional boxes. In this case, let's think about just having a regular grid arranged all through here, and that we're going to measure, say, the temperature and the direction of the airflow at each one of these boxes. Often you'll hear these called voxels. The idea then here is that we have a spatial field at which we have some attributes at every cell in that spatial field. So we still have this idea of attributes, but they are tied to particular spatial locations. Sometimes we even go so far as to say, well, maybe we actually have purely geometric data, things like the outline of a country. And that might be something where we do then need to actually incorporate that geometry. Now, a key point is this is starting to sound a bit like computer graphics if, after all, what we're doing is making pictures of things. What's the difference between graphics and visualization? And my own definition of that is questions about when is the geometry that you actually draw pictures of, when is that a decision by the designer rather than simply something you're given? So there are a lot of situations in visualization where at the end of the day there will be some geometric form that is being drawn, but there's a decision that got made about that particular geometry was the right one, and we didn't just get that for free. Now, what's important here is which kind of attributes do we have? So the really big division with thinking about the kinds of attributes, and now I'm not just thinking about the kinds of data sets, but the kind of attributes, is are they ordered or not? So categorical attributes, depending on which field you're from, sometimes you'll hear these called nominal or qualitative, but they say something is either in a category or not in a category. As opposed to something like ordered data, where there's actually an ordering between things. And the most well-known is quantitative, where you have things like, well, here's the length of my arm, and here's the length of my hand, and I could do arithmetic. I could actually subtract one to the other, and that would be defined. Now, it is possible to have data that's ordered but not quantitative. We're going to call that ordinal. So I like t-shirt sizes as a good example. You can say if someone gave you 3 t-shirts, you would always put the medium one in between the small and the large one if somebody asked you to order them. But it's not defined what a large t-shirt minus a medium t-shirt means, right? That doesn't have an intrinsic ordering. So as we'll see in a little bit, there's some reasons why this is a really fundamental division of attribute types. And then even if we have an order, we might also want to think, what's important? Should we think about this data as going from a minimum to a maximum? That we're going to call that sequential? Or is the semantics of the data set important to think about a 0 point and you diverge and you go downward and upward? Or is it the kind of data set where you actually wrap around? Think of things like seasonal data, some time data, where you often do have some idea of wraparound. Now, it's true that it's possible to change from diverging to sequential by a simple mathematical transformation. So if all you're thinking about is mathematics, then it's the case that these are basically trivially different from each other. They're really the same. But that's not how we're thinking. We're thinking about the human semantic meaning. How are people thinking about the data? What is their mental model? And as we'll see, there's some quite different ways we can visually encode this to emphasize that diverging versus sequential nature. And that's typically what we're trying to emphasize. So that was our whirlwind tour of what, our data abstraction. We can also think about why, our task abstraction. Why are people visualizing this data? And let's try to have some kind of vocabulary that's really not specific to the domain, but general. And one thing you'll notice if you start reading a lot of viz papers is there's a whole lot of action-target pairs that are verb-noun. And you'll notice phrases like discover distributions or compare trends or browse topological structure or locate outliers. And so this idea of verb and noun we can structure as actions and targets. So let's think about those. So with actions, one thing we can do at the very high level is we're often thinking about some form of analyzing data, where if you have existing data that you're consuming, you can think, going back to that first slide I talked about, are we trying to discover what's unknown or present something that's known? This is sometimes called exploration versus explanation or discovery versus presentation. Now, sometimes it's not quite so crisp and clean, and people aren't necessarily doing deep analysis, but they might be doing something more casual, like just looking at data in a newspaper article they happen to find intriguing or interesting. So we can think about some other cases, like just simply for pure enjoyment rather than because it's part of your day job. But I want to distinguish between consuming existing data and producing new data. So with producing new data, you might be, for example, adding annotations to an existing data set. You might be recording the history of using a visualization tool that's interactive, so you have some sort of log file of what you've done, maybe for reasons of provenance or replication. And an interesting one that we're going to go deeper into is you might be deriving new data in order to actually visually encode something that's directly helpful. We can also think about this question of how much of the data do you need to understand to answer the question you have? Are you just trying to find one thing? Let's call that identify. Do you need to compare a few things? Or, and in that case, you only need a few. You don't need to see all of it, but you need to see more than one. Or do you truly need to see all the data? Do you need to summarize across the entire data set? So that's a pretty high level and abstract way to think about these different ways of querying. So these are all pretty high level, but they allow us to start to think a bit systematically. Now, let's go back to that one about deriving. So the key idea is in visualization, the really simple and easy case is somebody hands you a data set and you draw a picture and you declare victory. But that is not the common case. What you often need to do is some series of transformations so that with the original data set, what you're given is not what you directly draw, you transform it, and then if you draw that transformed picture, you will have actually helped them with their task. So this is actually one of the 4 major strategies for handling complexity. We're going to run across the other 3 later on in the afternoon. Here's a classic example from the very first use, actually, of line charts from Playfair, hundreds of years ago, of showing the exports versus the imports of Britain. Now you can, the good thing is at least we've mapped this. You can look at the imports versus the exports, and you can try to mentally do some arithmetic of comparing these. But this is tricky. This has actually got some cognitive load. Yes, you're perceptually looking at these lines, but doing the math mentally to find the difference between those is much easier done where computationally you directly compute that, and then what you actually draw the picture of, in this case, is that difference, the balance of trade. And so this is a very simple example. Things, of course, get more complex as we derive things that maybe aren't just local pairwise comparisons, but maybe global quantities. Here's an example of that. What if what we want to do is derive an attribute of helping us think more usefully about a very large network or tree? So there are many metrics that have been proposed for trying to somehow quantify structural information about what's going on in graphs and trees. These are called centrality metrics. Here's a particular one called the Strahler metric. And what it's being used for in this picture is to say, well, what if I only have time to draw 5,000 nodes, but this data set has 50,000 nodes in it? What do I do? Well, if you draw the first 5,000 nodes in the file, you're going to see just a little corner in the upper left of that red stuff because of the way it happens to be distributed in the file. If instead you could go through and compute the centrality metric for every node in the graph and then say, oh, I'm going to filter and only draw the high scoring ones, we get actually quite a nice skeleton of the tree because things that have high centrality metrics are pretty central to that structure. So, well, what are we doing here? We're thinking about this as an analysis problem. We're thinking about, well, what do we have? We've got a tree. Well, why are we actually looking at that tree? We're trying to, in this case, we're doing an intermediate step. We're deriving data, in this case, computing this quantitative metric on the nodes. And then in our second phase, we can say, okay, now that we have a tree where every node has a number associated with it, I can easily filter. And then with that filtering step, now I can actually show people what they need to see. So that's kind of step-by-step going through and thinking about the tasks possibly as a chain series of actions of means to your eventual end is something that helps us analyze. Now, that was all the verbs, the actions. What about the nouns, the targets? What do we do these things to? Well, there's some really generic words that are used for pretty much all data sets. This idea of trying to find trends, that's a very common concept, or looking for outliers. These are ideas that work with any kind of these data types. Or more generally, I'm just defining features as anything you might have that's a domain-specific way of defining something. Let's give ourselves a way to talk about that. Now, a key question is, how many attributes do you need to actually solve your problem? It's very common that you might just need to look at a single attribute. You might need to examine a distribution, or maybe just look at those extreme min and max values of a distribution of one particular attribute. But some questions require comparisons between many attributes, like is one attribute dependent on another? Are two of them correlated to each other? Do we have some similarity metric across all of the attributes that we could use? So it's useful to ponder whether you're dealing with one attribute or more than one. Now, there's some kinds of questions you ask about particular data types. For example, in a network of nodes connected by links, you could ask questions about its topological structure. How are things connected? A particular special case of that is finding paths through that topological structure. Another key question is shape. What is the shape of something? Now, we typically reserve this question to ask of data that is intrinsically spatial, where the shape tells you something about the data set itself. In non-spatial data sets where the designer decides what spatial position to use for points, then that's not intrinsic to the data. That's a designer's decision. But with spatial data, often a very central question involves understanding its shape. And then that's one of the targets we would use in that context. So that was a very quick spin through these worlds of what and why. And this question of how, given that data and task abstraction, how could we visually encode and interact with it? That's what we're going to talk about the whole rest of the afternoon. So there's a lot here. I'm not going to try to summarize in that moment, but just think of this as a sneak peek for the world of how we might do that. So there's plenty of further reading. All of these are also available on the web, so you don't have to try to scribble down. But what that gives us is a quick spin through that world of what, why, and how, where we'll get to a lot of the how later. And let's take a few minutes to go to questions. Now, what people are encouraged to do, given that we are in the world of hybrid, and let me see if I can get to, where is my hybrid thing? Slido is what we are going to be putting the things into. So I do not yet see a question on Slido. Either you in the audience or you on camera in hybrid land could be the first to ask questions. What I'm going to suggest that everyone does, because an afternoon is a long time to sit, is that while questions are coming in, everyone should actually stand up and stretch before we move on to the next topic, because otherwise 3 straight hours is a lot to sit through. So stretch break and also question break. Yes, question in the back there.
Can you elaborate on the difference between computer graphics and visualization, both comparison and contrast, like sections?
So the first part I heard, which was, can I elaborate on the difference between computer graphics and viz, but I couldn't quite hear the rest.
I've also just the similarities as well, I guess. So just how does computer graphics fit in both visualization and visualization?
So I keep not hearing the last part.
Similarities.
I think he's got a mic there. Perfect.
Hi. I'm interested in the similarities and differences between computer graphics and viz and how computer graphics fits in your understanding of design for visualization.
So let's go back to that slide just for a moment. So the question is, what is this idea about the relationship? So typically what computer graphics is very good at is this question of, oh, you have a geometric object and we have a virtual camera, and we can think about this question of how to turn that into a picture with pixels that actually represent that. Often in graphics there's emphasis on photorealism, which is usually not our main concern here. But even in graphics there's plenty of things about more abstract ways, non-photorealistic rendering. So it's not just about realism versus non-realism. It's more about, and so what we do often, and let me actually go back to a different slide to emphasize, is this question of what's happening algorithmically. Graphics is a great source of algorithms, especially for some scalable rendering questions, like Well, as you have millions of points and then maybe a more finite number of pixels, maybe you want to be smart about how you render. So a lot of these questions of grabbing algorithms is something we will get from the graphics literature. But these more design-oriented questions like, is the thing we're drawing actually the thing people need to see? That typically gets more into the realm of HCI. And so I think visualization is this nice place where we really often steal methods from HCI and methods, that is algorithms from graphics, and we put them together because there's this judgment call. Does that help? Okay. All right, let us move on and jump forward to, did we have a, okay, second question. Oh wait, we have a microphone here.
Could you go back to the slide that you were just showing us?
Which one?
Yeah,
this one?
The graphics one. Yes, yes. So, what are some of the ways that, I mean, given that you have this huge body of work that you've done in visualization, so what are some of the ways in which you observe target users? Interviews is one method, right? What are some of the methods that you have used to observe users?
Right, so this question of, so how do we figure out what users need? You know, one way is interviewing. And so there's different flavors of interviewing. For example, contextual inquiry is a method that's particularly good where you're actually interviewing people in your place of work. There's some nice work by Karen Holtzblatt who really introduced a lot of these techniques where when you're dealing with not just people, but also their data, you have to think carefully about which methods out of general HCI work well and don't. For example, in HCI, sometimes you design a system and then you watch users using it and you're not allowed to say anything. You're a fly on the wall, your lips are sealed, you can't say, no, 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 just hit that button because you want to see usability problems. But often in visualization, they're doing something extremely complex in their heads and you do need to get much more from them about what they're thinking about as you do it. So sometimes instead of fly on the wall methods, you might use these methods which are much more about inquiring, and that's what some of these ideas of contextual inquiry are. Other ideas is that you not only interview people, but you observe them. You observe what they're doing before you deploy your new tool, and you observe what they do after you deploy either the final version or intermediate version. So there's a lot of well-known things where people tend to not remember things they spend time on. Retrospective retroflexion is not really such a great technique. So the part where you observe them in addition to interviewing them can be great. And so there's definitely a lot of methods for this. And in general, user-centered design, which is typically quite iterative, is exactly because you don't assume they can simply write down a spec. So, excuse me. And then you talk a lot. One moment. So that's at least a partial answer. And I'll see if I have more time to get into it later, but one of the things in that design study methodology paper I mentioned is it goes kind of deep into what some of the methods are that are more appropriate for visualization as opposed to others. Okay, let me quickly check on Slido. Nope. So let's now move on and talk about this idea of marks and channels. Okay, running a little bit behind, but that's all right. So, we're going to start in this world of how by really focusing on how do we arrange things in space? How do we use spatial position to convey information? But let's start by actually asking this question of how could we even decompose one of these, remember, we're calling them idioms. How do you think systematically about visual encoding? And in this simple case, we can start by thinking about marks and channels. So surely you've seen bar charts and scatter plots before. This is not a novel, earth-shattering idea, but let's talk about them structurally. So we have this idea of marks we can think of as geometric primitives that convey information where you're mapping an item into some sort of mark. It could be a point or maybe a line or some area. It could be a volume. So what do? We control the appearance of the mark through what we're going to call a visual channel, and that's how we're conveying the information, typically. So, right, there's spatial position, there's color, there's shape, there's size, there's orientation. So these are all ways to control the appearance of a mark to convey information. So this is like the sort of basic Lego bricks of visualization. Now, what's tricky is not all channels are created equally. There's different amounts of information that you can read out of these channels, and they convey different types of information to humans through our visual system. So let's just start with the basics. What's going on at the bar chart? Well, we're using vertical spatial position to convey a quantitative attribute. So we're using a line as a mark. What's going on at the scatter plot? Well, now we want to separately encode both vertical and horizontal spatial position. Our mark type has been switched to a point so that we can do both of those at once. Well, what have we done here? Well, we're color coding. We have added a third channel. And then what are we doing? Well, we've added a fourth channel, size coding, in addition to color coding those points in that scatter plot. So this gives us a way to think systematically about what's going on with idioms. Of course, these are the simple ones. It's going to get more complex. So how do we know which channels to use? And the answer is we have many, many, many decades of experiments that people have done that give us at least partial answers for some of these questions. And one key idea is that these two sides of the screen are split on purpose. On the left, we have the magnitude channels. They convey information about how much directly to your perceptual system. These are a good match for attributes that are ordered. On the right, we have what we'll call identity channels. They're really good at saying what something is. So for example, you can say how far along an aligned scale is something? How much is it tilted? You know, how saturated is it? How curvy? These are all questions we ask for magnitude channels. Whereas you can say, what is something? What color is it? What shape is it? What is the direction of motion? What region is it in? So a key idea is you want to match up. Remember how we talked about attribute types of being categorical versus ordered? You want to match the expressiveness, because if you try to show ordered data with these identity channels, you're going to lose information. And if you try to show unordered data in a way that implies to your perceptual system there's an ordering with these magnitude channels, you might introduce spurious information that's not really in the data set. So trying to match the expressiveness is one big idea. So do keep track of those types. Another idea is effectiveness, because remember the part where I said they're not all created equal. The amount of data that you can decode from these channels is different. And these are actually ordered from top to bottom on purpose. There's some rough equivalence classes, but things like the ability to make really precise spatial position judgments, as humans we're very good at, whereas the ability to notice things like three-dimensional area or the three-dimensional depth into the scene or even the amount of saturation of a color, we don't have nearly such fine-tuned ability to make those distinctions. So the effectiveness is something that differs between the channels. Now, the reason that we don't just have single bar charts for everything is in some cases we have multiple attributes we have to encode simultaneously, so we want to use more. We might have all kinds of nuances on what we're trying to show. So this is not a straitjacket, but it can be a guide for making choices. A thing I'd like you to notice is that things about spatial position are up at the top of both of these. We're really good at accurate spatial perception for those magnitude channels, and we really notice when things are divided into different regions of space, stuff that's on the one side versus the other side. So proximity and visual grouping is something that we're actually really good at noticing. So this is why I'm going to emphasize spatial position so much in this first set of sections after this, because it's so fundamental to our perceptual system. So let's talk about some basics. What's going on with accuracy? Well, it turns out there were decades of work in what's called psychophysics, which is measuring human response to stimuli through different sensory modalities. And to summarize 50 years of work, S.S. Stevens actually found that there was a power law. And what changes is the exponent according to which modality you're in. And one reason that spatial position is so accurate, this is the one where that exponent is basically 1. We're very good at making things like two-dimensional judgments of length and position. We're not so good. We have a compressed response to things like area and depth into the scene and brightness. We have a magnified response to things like saturation. And don't worry, when it says electric shock, it's like a tingling on the fingertips. It's not something involving something terrible. But the point is, some things we have a compressed response to, some things we have a magnified response to. Very few things do we have a one-to-one response. So this is part of what's going on. There's quite a bit more to that, but in the interest of blasting through almost an entire textbook with the stuff in an afternoon, I'm going to leave that go and move on to the question of what happens when we use more than one channel together? To what extent can we decode things separately, or are they integrated by your brain together in a way that's hard to disentangle? So let's start with that first one, where what we've got is with separability, position and color are really separable. You can either attend to the idea that there's stuff on the left and stuff on the right, or you can attend to the idea that there's blue stuff and red stuff. And you can just choose which you want to pay attention to. They're fully separable. It's very easy to just switch your attention system to either one. Things get trickier. Those of you who are in the back, it's pretty easy to figure out that there's purple and blue dots for the big ones. It's a little harder to notice for the small ones. Our ability to perceive color depends on the size of the colored object. So there is an interaction effect where the smaller it is, the less you're able to read color coding. So it's some interference, but you still are able to think about big stuff, little stuff, purple stuff, blue stuff. What about here? What if I tell you that I'm trying to encode one thing with width and one thing with height? The problem is you're going to often end up seeing big stuff, small stuff, and squished stuff. And you might not really care so much about is it squished horizontally or vertically. It's really easy to start seeing three groups of things here. So even instead of seeing two different separable groups of two, we start to just see three groups. And here on the side, with red versus green, it's the worst case. I can tell you that I carefully encoded one level of red and another level of red, and one level of green and another level of green. But your perceptual system simply integrates those together into this idea of color, and you really just see four categories. And you can't try to read off those things I encoded, because your ability to decode is controlled by your perceptual system essentially merging together. So this is certainly a case of what not to do with color. We'll get back to more about color in a bit. But the lesson I want you to think about is when are things separable, and if you are counting on them to be separable, it's an important point, versus when is your perceptual system integrating those together. So far I've been kind of really focused on the idea that you've got an item of data and you're encoding it with a mark. But what about some other things? What about this idea, for example, of enclosure or containment? Your perceptual system is very capable of noticing when one mark is contained within another. And you can use that to show, for example, hierarchical structure. We can also actually draw a mark that indicates connection of a link rather than simply individual items. And we'll talk about those a lot more when we get to talking about drawing networks and trees. I also want you to notice that you can convey the idea of a group by, in all of these identity channels that we usually use to show categorical data, you can have things be the same. You could use proximity, have things in the same spatial region. You could have similarity indicated simply by having the same value. So you can notice, all the red things versus all the blue things. And you will think of them as similar because your perceptual system is noting this common encoding with these identity channels. So these are ways to convey that things are grouped together perceptually. So there's certainly lots more reading about that. Again, those are linked to in the, oh, that's a typo. That should say 22, not 20, at the bottom there. But I'm going to take a break and check if there are any questions. And I will first check Slido. Not yet any questions on Slido. What about in person? Are there any quick questions on marks and channels? Going once? Going twice? Okay, for this one, do a mini stretch in your chairs while we get ready to move on to tabular data. All right. So, back to this idea of how are we encoding? So let's actually dive in and think, well, how could we use space? And let's dive deeper into this question of what's going on with the table anyway. So I mentioned that with simple tables, well, things are simple. So I'm going to bring up this idea of a key and a value. So for those of you with a CS background, this is maybe straightforward to think about. For those of you with a stats background, you might tend to call these independent versus dependent variables. But let's think of a key as an index. It's something you use to look up an item. And if you've got a simple flat table, then you'll have one key. If you've got a multi-dimensional table, well, you'll need multi-dimensional keys, right? So how is it that you could look at something in a spreadsheet, or if you had a multi-dimensional array in a programming language, well, you need some number of keys to be able to look something up. Right? In my example I showed you at the beginning with perceptual versus cognitive, I showed you something where I had a data set where there were both genes and time points. And so you had to look up a gene and a time point in order to get a value that in that case was visually encoded with color. So we're going to use this idea of keys and values as a way to categorize visual encodings of information. And so I'm going to classify ways of encoding tables according to the question of, well, how many keys do they have? None, one, two, or a lot? So let's start out with none. Well, that's actually what a scatter plot is. In a scatter plot, you are just directly expressing a quantitative attribute with the channel of spatial position. So we don't have a key, we're plotting the values directly. And in particular, we have two values we're plotting. So we have two quantitative attributes. Our mark type is points. So what are our channels? Well, it's horizontal and vertical spatial position. So what tasks is this good for? Well, it's great for things like finding trends, for noticing outliers, right? There's an outlier up in that upper right corner. We can think about distributions separately from horizontal versus vertical, although it's not quite as easy to see as some other things we'll see later that are just focused on one attribute at once. You could try to find correlation, right? If this is a tight correlation versus a looser one, as we see on the left. We could try to see, is there a cluster structure? You know, in this one, not so much. Some scatter plots you see really separate clumps. Now, and here's a question. I've set up this kind of systematic way to think about this. What data, what channels, what tasks. And when I talk about scalability, I'm going to think about what if you had 1,000 by 1,000 pixels in which to draw this, just as a baseline. And we're going to think, well, how many items could we draw? And, well, we could certainly try to fit hundreds. It might depend a bit on the characteristics of the data. With some data sets, there's a lot of overplotting. There's a lot of points all on top of each other. We'll talk later about some ways of dealing with that in a visual encoding context. But if we just have a simple scatter plot, well, that's a kind of fundamental limitation. So you could imagine, for example, if you had 10 million points and only 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, probably things would get overwhelming. You wouldn't be able to see, there would be visual clutter. So I'm going to do this kind of scalability analysis for many of the idioms that we'll talk about throughout the afternoon, just to get some kind of calibration of scale. Now, what happens once we start to have some combination of keys and values? Well, I spent a lot of time telling you that we should really think carefully about the characteristics of our data, and when do we have ordered data and when do we have categorical data. So if spatial position is one of these ordered quantities, well, how do we deal with categorical data at all? And the answer is we typically do divide space up into regions. So you can think about separating into different regions, and maybe really simple regions in which we'll do something like just draw a single line mark. And then we could use a different attribute, an ordered attribute, to pick the order for those regions. And often, in order to get the highest precision of ability to make judgments, we're going to align them. Notice how it's actually easier to tell these heights exactly what's going on when they all have a shared common baseline. That's this aligned position or common frame. So separating into spatial regions, ordering them and aligning them according to some ordinal attribute or ordered attribute is a way to actually use space. So this all sounds kind of abstract. Let's think about a simple example. Bar charts. You have all seen them. But structurally, what is going on in a bar chart? Well, we've got a key and a value. So we've got a categorical attribute and we have a quantitative attribute. So we've got a line mark. And what are we doing? Well, we're expressing that quantitative value, in this case with the height of the bar. And what we've done is we've divided space up into regions, and then we've picked an ordering. Now, it could be an ordering that's maybe somewhat arbitrary, like the alphabetical letter that the name of the animal starts with here, and then maybe it's hard to see patterns. We can do something that's more data-driven, where we don't order them alphabetically, we order them by the data that we are actually plotting here. So that kind of data-driven ordering often is a way to make it much easier to understand, for example, the minimum and maximum extremes. What are these good for? Well, they're particularly good for detailed comparison between a few values. They can be great even for just simply looking up a single value. Now, what about the scale? Well, for how many bars could we fit in a bar chart, right, is one question. That's about that key attribute. If you had 1,000 pixels, maybe you could even have more than 100 bars. If you have fewer pixels, maybe you want to keep it to perhaps dozens of bars. So for that key attribute, you might get dozens. Now, let me see, do I have? Now, one interesting question to think about is, what about for the value attribute? What is the scale for that? We're able to make actually extremely fine-grained noticing of differences between a bar that's a little bit higher than another bar, especially if they're right next to each other. So I would argue that in the limit, if you have 1,000 pixels of vertical height, you could probably fit maybe 1,000 levels of that. Of course, you're not going to be able to see 1,000,000 differences, but you can definitely see hundreds of different levels in the height of the bars, because we have that fine-grained ability to see aligned spatial positions. Let's think of a different case, a stacked bar chart. What's going on with this? Well, we've added a second key attribute. So now we have 2 categorical attributes and a quantitative one. Now we're doing something more complicated. We're not just using a single line segment here. We'll be talking more about these more complex things. I'm just for now going to call this a glyph. It's a composite object where we actually have multiple marks inside of it. In this case, they're simple marks. They're just line segments. So now we're using, in this case, both length and color. And so what are some things to notice? Well, we can see the height of the entire bar well. We can see the height of those lowest segments in light green and make really detailed comparisons. We can still see the lengths of the red bars, but they're harder to make detailed comparisons because they start at different places. They are not aligned anymore. So what is particularly possible with a stacked bar chart that we weren't thinking about doing with the bar chart is we're seeing part to whole relationships. The part, which is one of these segments, how much of the whole, which is the length of the entire bar, do they extend over? Now, what I want to get to is scale. So in some ways, these are just like bar charts, but there's an interesting way that there's an asymmetry. I said before that we could have, hundreds of different spatial positions of heights of bars we could notice. But would you want to have hundreds of segments in a stacked bar chart? It would not work at all. Your head would explode. You wouldn't be able to decode the information. So for that attribute, the categorical attribute that's being stacked, you can have several levels, maybe up to about a dozen max. But there's a real asymmetry. So even though you might have many, many dozens, maybe even hundreds of bars and hundreds of different vertical positions of the bars in terms of height, you could not do that for the stacked attribute. So the scalability analysis that we're going to really focus on often is when there's asymmetries, when there are differences between idioms, or when we have to think about how many levels that we could have within one of these attributes. By levels, I just mean number of different unique values. So continuing on with our bar chart theme, what's going on with what's called a normalized stacked bar chart? Well, that's another way to think about a part to whole judgment, where instead of just taking a stacked bar chart, and here you see we've got 1 bar for each of the 50 states, now what we're doing is we're normalizing to the bar height. And that really supports even better this idea of a part to whole comparison, much more so even than we had in the standard stacked bar chart. Now, one thing to notice is this idea of information density. How many pixels does it take to convey the information? And you'll note that actually what's going on in a normalized stacked bar chart is the same as what's going on in a pie chart, only typically you're able to use many fewer pixels to actually express that. So because you're not using as many, if you had to see 50 pie charts, we would definitely need a lot more room than we're using in this view here, where we are able to make judgments about the 50 states. So while we're thinking about idioms, let's move on and think a little bit about pie chart. Well, what's going on here? So with a pie chart, what we've got is you're actually having the area of the mark itself be the thing that's getting encoded because you're using that angle or orientation or tilt channel. So what's actually going on with decoding this information? Well, remember how we saw that the channels were not all created equal. And people have thought hard about this question of what are people actually decoding when they look at a bar chart. So whether or not it's angle, that angle directly, or the area of the wedge, or actually the arc length around the perimeter, all of those are not as accurate to perceive as the length of a line. So although there's a strong similarity between the bar chart and the pie chart structure, they both have a categorical attribute for the key and a quantitative attribute for the value, the visual channels you're using are quite different. So you are more able to make these high precision judgments with the bar chart. Well, what if we did the other thing? What's called a coxcomb chart, which is kind of a more direct analog to a bar chart, is where now we've got a mark and we are encoding data with the length of the mark, and you're just laying these marks out radially around. It's as if you took a bar chart and wrapped this axis around in a circle. So is this a good idea? What's going on here? Why is it that hopefully maybe you don't see these so often? What's really tricky and what we want to think about is what have we encoded as a designer versus what is the human user's eyes decoding as the reader. And so the tricky thing about these coxcomb plots is that what you're encoding is actually the length of the wedge. But often what people decode is the area of the wedge, and that varies in a nonlinear way with the length. In a bar chart that's rectilinear, well, it doesn't matter. The top of the bar, there's still the equal. But with this, you're seeing these really nonlinear amounts of area for the big ones versus the little ones. And that nonlinearity is really a problem. So when a lot of people critique some of these radial visualizations, sometimes it gets down to these kinds of nonlinearities. It is, of course, possible to have a radial bar chart that doesn't have that width nonlinearity. That is safer, certainly, than doing something like a coxcomb plot. Although you often want to think with these radial things, when are you actually encoding it in a way that's useful, and when are you able to use high precision accurate judgments versus lower precision? Here we've got length, and here, but we don't just have length, because here we also have length, but here we have aligned spatial position aligned against a baseline in a way that we don't here. Mathematically, you can transform one to the other with a simple transformation from Cartesian to polar coordinates. But your perceptual system is doing quite different things. You get this high precision aligned judgment for free in a way that you don't here. So this is an indication where we always have to be careful about what you can do with math versus what the perceptual system is doing. So when are radial things good? They can be particularly good when you have cyclic data because they emphasize the cyclic nature of that data because radial things wrap around. Whereas rectilinear things, the start and the end, are quite separate for each other. So this is a nice example for Hadley Wickham, the same person who designed ggplot and the whole tidyverse, in a paper with Heike Hoffman and Dai Cook. And what they point out is certain things are really easy to see with the linear charts. Same data above and below, one's rectilinear, one is radial. And with the linear charts, you can really notice things like it's trending up versus it's trending down. But basically, all those squiggles kind of look similar at the end. Whereas with the radial charts, it's not nearly kind of so obvious about upward versus downward trends, but it's really obvious when it's just a little bit less than, a little bit more than in terms of that cyclic matching up and wrapping around. So understanding cyclic patterns can be easier with the radial one. So there are some good reasons to use radial versus rectilinear, but you want to be careful and make sure that you are taking into account the cost of usually not having high precision comparisons to things like the benefit of getting that wraparound radius. Let's move on and actually now talk not just about having a single key value, but what happens when you have two key values, where you're using both of those keys with spatial position. So here's an example of a heat map. These are widely used in fields like biology and also some others. Ironically, the paper that introduced heat maps for biology said, don't do this. They ignored that part of the paper. People have been doing it ever since. So what's going on here? Well, we have two categorical attributes. You can think of these as the things you use to look up. So these are the keys. In this case, let's go back to that example of genes and experimental conditions. And then you have a quantitative attribute, which is the level of the gene expression. Think of that as how turned on or turned off the gene is. So what are we doing here? We're actually doing that separation and aligning in both directions, horizontal and vertical, into this two-dimensional matrix layout, rather than just along vertically or horizontally separately. Now, what's going on with the color coding? We'll talk more about color in a bit. Technically, it's an ordered diverging color map. But the part I want you to notice is, well, let's think about scale, right? We could do things like notice clusters for the task or find outliers, like here's a very light green one without a whole lot of others nearby. What is the scale? So in the limit, let's say again, 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. So you could have maybe 1,000 of these for each of these. So you could have 1,000 genes by 1,000 experimental conditions. That would give you 1 pixel per item. So that's the limit of what you could see. So that's 1,000,000 items. Now, how many attributes could you actually use here? We can't see 100 different shades of green or 100 different shades of red. Well, you can probably notice in the back, there's super bright green, not quite so bright green, maybe a little bit less bright, dim green, super dim green, black. In a good day, maybe you can have about 5 shades of green and 5 shades of red that you can reliably tell apart when they're scattered about in space. So we only have about 10 levels of this quantitative attribute. Whereas before I said when we were doing things like bar charts, we could tell maybe the difference between hundreds because we had that really high precision ability to see different aligned spatial positions. We have a much lower precision ability to see these saturated colors. So that's this asymmetry that lets us really think about the differences between some of these attributes. So what we've done is we've talked a bit about this idea of arranging tables. We've thought about expressing values that are just quantitative keys, separating, ordering, and aligning regions, this idea of maybe having a one-dimensional layout versus a two-dimensional matrix layout. Talk just a little bit about the ideas of rectilinear and radial axes. So, now what could we do if we move on and don't just think about tabular data? What if we think about spatial data? Now, a lot of the ideas we've just talked about are still going to transfer. So we're going to take everything we've just learned, but build up to this idea of what if there were spatial data? What could we do? And let's start with an easy example of two-dimensional geographic data. So a choropleth map is just the big fancy name for a map where you've color-coded the geographic regions on the map. So what's going on here? Well, we talked about expressing and then separating, ordering, and aligning. Now let's talk about just using data. You have given spatial data and you are using it. And we're doing that when the central task is to actually understand those spatial relationships. We need to know things like the proximity of different spatial regions. In this case, we're looking at a quantitative attribute just on the map of the US. So how do we analyze this? We've got this geometric data, going back to that question about graphics versus visualization. The geometric data is given, and we're making the decision that what we want to do is color code each region. So you can think of this as both that spatial geometry and then an accompanying table where for each item that had the geometric outline, we also have a table with that outline and some quantitative attribute. And so then we're able to actually map that attribute into here. So we're using the given geometry for the boundaries, and then we're using color. And again, we'll talk more about exactly the details of how to map with color. All I want you to notice here is that we are using color. Now, beware. As usual, XKCD has a comic for every situation. And when this one, what we see is there are a lot of spurious correlations where when you actually color code things like data corresponding to humans, you see where humans live. And you might not see anything in particular about the attribute you picked. So we can have snarky remarks on this, but the thing that I want you to remember is that they didn't normalize, right? So what you need to do is, in the case of chloroplasts, always think about whether you should normalize by something like the population density. And even more generally, this is not just a point about chloroplasts. In general, you always want to think about when can you show absolute data and have it mean what you intend, and when do you need to normalize, show relative rather than absolute data. So it's not just a problem with bad choropleth map design. In general, think about when do you need to normalize. So what else could we do? Well, if we've got the idiom of a topographic map, again, we're still just using a simple two-dimensional map in some sense, but what we now have is we can think of it as a field of data. We have at every point sampled regularly along this map, not only a two-dimensional geometry, but a height. And what we're doing, and we're taking that attribute and we're trying to derive new data. So the fancy term for this isoline is just saying isocontour, meaning the levels where it is the same value. And by actually drawing those levels as derived geometry, any of you who've used a topographic map know that when these lines are very close together, that means there's a really steep slope. We can start to see things like the peaks of mountains and valleys and actually flat regions, in this case near sea level, where not a lot is changing. So this is an example of combining derived data that came from a spatial field with, in this case, given data of the geometry. Now there's an analog to this one dimension higher. What's very common in what used to be called scientific visualization in the SciVis conference is where you say, well, we've got spatial field data, and we're really focused on the question of how to represent what's going on in these spatial fields. So the simple case is where you have what's called a scalar spatial field, where at each one of these cells, you can think of it as a 2D grid, but very common, it's a 3-dimensional grid. At every one of these, you've got a quantitative attribute. How can you show people what's going on? After all, in the volumetric case, you can't just start drawing everything because there's a volume, you can't see through the whole thing. So the task in dealing with this 3-dimensional volumetric data is typically very focused on understanding shape and understanding spatial relationships of what things are near each other and not. And so there's 2 main families of algorithms for handling this, and they give different visual encodings. So the isosurface approaches are where you're deriving the data, just like we saw in the topographic map, of what's called isocontours, 1 dimension higher. You're going to look at a 2-dimensional surface that's computed for a specific level of the values. Then you typically do something smart with using semi-transparent surfaces so that you have a hope of seeing multiple structures and their shapes in relation to each other. But with isosurface algorithms, you are directly computing geometry, so it's a derived quantity. Whereas in the family of algorithms for direct volume rendering, you don't actually compute an explicit geometry. Instead, you use what's called a transfer function, where you're mapping values of that scalar attribute at these different points in space directly to color and transparency or opacity values. And so you don't actually have derived geometry. You're using algorithms that are very related to a lot of ideas out of computer graphics to actually draw those pixels directly. So these are ways of dealing with spatial data that have different algorithmic underpinnings and thus actually different structures in terms of whether or not you derive geometric data. What if you have more than one attribute at every one of these points in your spatial fields? Well, with vector fields, and then they're higher analogs of tensor fields where you have many quantitative attributes, not just 2 at every point, what could you do? Well, again, there are different idioms of how to actually encode this data. And with some of them, you're doing something that's purely local. You have a little glyph, maybe it's something like an arrowhead. You typically don't just want to have a single line segment where you can't tell directions, so you at least have a bit more complexity of putting an arrowhead on a little line segment so you can get some sense of directionality. And so you can either purely locally draw all of these, maybe at regular points in space, or you can do more complex things. You can actually go through and say, well, you could derive the data of putting a particle in one place and then simulating how the forces in that vector field would actually make that particle flow. So this is computing a derived trajectory. And typically you would do that maybe from some sparse set of original points. Or you could say, well, let's take something like a white noise texture and smear it in a much more dense way from a lot of different initial starting points. Or you might say, well, let's actually try to do computations directly to find explicitly the kind of features that you might hope emerged with these other methods. Notice how you can see these kind of things where there's vortices, where things come together. You can actually try to compute things like sinks and saddle surfaces and emitters of flow. So sources and sinks and saddles are things you could compute explicitly, and then you could visualize them using any of these other visual encoding methods. So these are ways to think about this kind of spatial data that's fields with multiple attributes. Here's a nice example of deriving data where we actually have a number of steps along the way, and we start to see some of the complexity of these kinds of things. So the specific idiom is similarity clustered streamlines. So let's decompose this and understand what's going on. Let's say that we have one of these three-dimensional vector fields, so very large volume of space. We've got data at every single one of these points. Well, if we just drew it all, it would be incomprehensible. We have to do something smarter. So the first thing they do is have derived data of the streamlines, which are these trajectories that the particles would follow. And they seeded them from just one corner of this box. So a very small number of seed points compared to the entire volume. And then what they do is for each one of these computed complex lines, they compute a lot of metrics. Things like curvature, torsion, and tortuosity. These all come down to different ways of basically measuring the squiggliness and curviness of these lines. And then they have a weighted combination of these that they call the signature, and then they compute a clustering of the signatures. So they try to say, well, where are these things, these lines roughly doing similar things? And we'll talk more about the idea of computing a hierarchy of clusterings as a really fundamental method for giving you power and visualization. In this case, they've taken these and they've computed the clusters of the ones that are roughly similar, and then they're going to color code by the cluster so that we can really see the red versus the purple and see what's going on here. So let's tie this back to tasks. What are people trying to do? We're trying to let them see things like the features of this data that might be interesting. In this case, it's sort of the amount of squiggliness. And the shape is a completely central question. What shape are these lines is part of why we are visualizing this to find out. So that shape is not an arbitrary decision by a designer. It's a fundamental attribute of the data. And that's what's being emphasized in these kinds of visual encodings. Now, the hard part about a lot of these is handling the sheer scale of the data, right? There's actually millions of sample points in this original grid, and the number of streamlines they compute is in the hundreds. And so a lot of the challenge of these is how do you actually, at the algorithm level, achieve interactive response? And there's a bunch of interesting algorithmic questions here. Although what I've focused on here is the structural question of what are they doing to visually encode. So we've had just a quick tour, again, through arranging spatial data. We're using the spatial data that you're given, whether it's just the direct geometry of something like a cartographic border, or these spatial fields, whether you have one value per cell as in with the scalar fields, or many with the vector and tensor fields. This gives you some sense of the design space of what's possible. Again, with this one, we do have further reading, but what I want to do now is take some time for questions. I think we've got about 6 or 7 minutes before the break. So what I am going to do is, while we're talking, leave this open to Slido. And aha, we have some Slido questions. So Gordon says, if I use color hue to encode an ordinal value, is that a failure of effectiveness, since it's harder to correctly judge things about the values, or of expressiveness, because hue confounds the visual ordering? I struggle to explain this to students. So let's actually see if we can get this side by side. We're going to grab that's actually later. That's okay. Let's take that one here. Can only think if I've got these things side by side. So my first thought is maybe it's both. Maybe it is both an effectiveness issue because you are losing information about the order, I would say, I mean, what's also complex is this question of, so in some ways this question is foreshadowing a little bit about the stuff we'll be talking about later in the color chapter, where we've separated color into hue, which is identity and thus good for categorical, versus things like luminance and saturation, which are good for magnitude. And a key thing is that there's not an intrinsic perceptual ordering with hue, the way there is, for example, gray is between white and black, but it's not necessarily the case that red is always in between yellow and blue. I happen to put it there, but somebody else might have put it in another position. So it is true that there is not fundamentally a ordering. You can have one learned, you can have a legend that dictates one, but your perceptual system will not read that out. So I typically would say that the primary issue is the expressiveness part. But it is also true that there's an effectiveness issue, which is that the kind of number of gradations might be harder to judge. So I think my answer to Gordon is, I think the bigger sin in this one is the expressiveness mismatch, and the smaller sin is the effectiveness mismatch, but they are both still there. Although I do think it's debatable. Elias asks, to what extent is the redundancy of visual representations of the same data effective? So the short answer is it can be quite effective. So redundantly encoding multiple things, for example, a bar chart that both uses spatial position of the different bars and also color codes by the data. So anytime you're using multiple channels at once, that is going to be more effective, because essentially you're getting two ways of getting information into your brain through the perceptual system. So if it's so great, why don't we do it all the time? It's because it uses up channels. So if you've used two channels to encode the same attribute, you then no longer have those channels available to encode anything else. So if all you're trying to do is send one message about one attribute, great, redundantly encode it, use them all up to give that crucial message. But we've been looking at a lot of really simple cases just to try to do some structural analysis. When things get more complex, and people are often in those kinds of design studies or other contexts, you might have data sets where you've got many attributes, and you're often trying to support multiple tasks through an interface, sometimes with multiple windows, but sometimes just with one direct visually encoded view. So if you use up a channel, if you use up more than one channel per attribute, then it limits the number of other attributes you could simultaneously encode. So it's really just a question of, it's very straightforward to get more signal into your brain in that way, but you lose the ability to say other things. Yevgeny, there's so many viz designs nowadays organized in different taxonomies where you just pick a viz depending on your data and task. Do you think this approach is effective, or is it still better to go throughout all the steps of viz design? Well, like many questions, my answer to this is it depends, but now let's say depends on what. So there are a lot of situations where if what you're doing is reasonably well understood and straightforward, and so for example, you're doing something where some common, known statistical charts are enough to convey the information, then it might be possible to use a pretty chart-based approach. So these taxonomies, which are basically saying, oh, if you're doing a part-to-whole relationship, and these are the characteristics of your data, then pick, say, normalized stacked bars, as we talked about a moment ago. So that works well when you understand your task very well, and when a chart exists that is a good match for that task. I think there's a lot of situations where we are beyond that really small part of the design space that's well understood. So for example, as we start to get into questions like visualizing networks, where there's been a huge amount of work in graph drawing and encoding node-linked networks, and there's a lot of trade-offs and heuristics. So I think in the more well understood the section of the design space is, the more you could use a more kind of straightforward chart taxonomy approach, the more that what you're trying to do is something that's outside what's known, especially if you're doing something where people have quite complex tasks and complex data, then you're gonna need to follow these design principles more. So think of these taxonomies as shortcuts. When you understand where you are, you could get away with shortcuts. When you're already in the wilderness and you don't know where you're going, a shortcut could lead you into quicksand. So I think they have their place. But when you're doing something that's more of a kind of custom design, you want to think more about those principles. I see one last question. Why do current systems out there only limit us to line, bar, and pie charts? Why do we not see things like coxcomb, chloropleth, streamlines, and so on? I mean, the short answer is it depends on what systems you use. So typically, some systems are designed for example, simple tabular data. So, Tableau has a little bit of support for example, geographic data. You can do chloropleth maps in Tableau, but it's not going to support streamlines because it's not designed to handle these kind of, large three-dimensional spatial field data sets. Whereas VTK is fantastic at streamlines. It's got entire modules for that. So often there are different tools that really target different parts of the design space, particularly that large split that is how I like to think of things as tables versus networks versus spatial data. So that can be a way to think, what was this tool aiming at, right? D3 is also not aiming at streamlines. Then you'd want to use an underlying library like something like maybe Web3D that's much more focused on 3D and performance and scalability. I would argue I'm glad there's not a lot of coxcomb charts out there because they're so incredibly confusing to people. So some tools have built in the idea of some kind of guidance and design and chart types that they're promoting as good, and maybe some they choose not to even implement as bad. But I think the more common thing is that they're really just focused on a different part, particularly of the data space, although in some senses also the task space. So the best well understood section of the design space, I would say, are the simple statistical graphics charts for relatively small tables. That is the more understood. As you get further and further out, things are less understood and there's less direct support in tools, and there tends to be more sort of boutique design study style things. And then at some point, as new idioms get designed, sometimes then they start spreading and catching on. I think a good example of that is upset, which was originally a research paper here at Viz, back 10 years ago. And at this point, it's a way of looking at sets. It's now really been implemented across at least 4 different chains, including D3 and the tidyverse and so on. And so sometimes a good idea will start to spread. All right, it's now after 3:30. Let me try to remember what our original timing was on this. Aha, in fact, we are way over because we were supposed to end at 3:15 and it is now 3:30. So let us wrap up for now and take a break. And I believe, is it the case that we start again at 1:45? Okay, so sorry, going to be a short break because we ran a little bit over, but we will reconvene at 1:45, which is in about 12 minutes.